want to turn now to the latest details on that horrific and tragic Midair collision near Washington, D.C. 67 people are presumed dead after a military helicopter and a passenger plane collided in the 9 o'clock Eastern hour last night. Both the jet, which was carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew members, and the helicopter carrying another 3 people crashed into the Potomac River. I want to show you a live look now where crews have essentially been engaged all day in recovery operations. Authorities did announce this morning they believe there would be no survivors. And this is the moment where those aircrafts collided. Just a huge boom in the sky. The passenger jet was on an approach down into Ronald Reagan International Airport, that DCA airport, just about 15 minutes outside of Washington's downtown core, where the White House is actually. American officials say they are still investigating the cause of the crash.
So we will look at all the humans that were involved in this accident. Again, we will look at the aircraft, we will look at the helicopter, we will look at the environment in which they were operating in. We have not recovered the flight data recorders yet. We know they're there. They are underwater. Once we get those, we'll be able to get those read and information from them to be able to provide further information to you.
Anita Anand is Canada's Minister of Transport. We spoke a little bit earlier. Have a listen. Hi, Minister. Great to have you back on the show. I appreciate you making the time.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
I did want to start off. I noticed on social media that you had posted you were monitoring the investigation and, of course, the events of this horrifying crash. What is the latest information you can share with Canadians about that?
Vassy, of course, we are monitoring the situation and we are sending our condolences and thoughts to the family and the crew who were impacted, and indeed everyone who is grieving. The Transportation Safety Board has just released a statement stating that it will be sending 2 investigators to support the United States in this investigation.
And is that, I guess, what more light can you shed on? Is that essentially because the plane was made by Bombardier? Is that the connection?
Yes, exactly. The plane that was impacted in the incident is a Canadian-made plane, and therefore the Canadian authorities are going to be participating in the investigation. But as a government, and certainly as a minister, I stand ready to support my American counterparts in this investigation, given the tragedy that everyone witnessed last night.
Yeah, and to your point, I do think Canadians were just glued last night and today to the imagery. And, you know, so many of us who fly, and there are millions of Canadians who do so, putting themselves in the shoes of people and thinking, oh, that's, you know, that's literally your worst nightmare. I'm wondering if you can speak to those Canadians who might, and there is an important context here. Look, there's not been something like this in the U.S. since 2009, 150 million commercial flights in the interim. But still, you see that happen and you worry, my goodness, could that happen to me? For those Canadians who are worried tonight about, you know, heading onto an airplane, what would you tell them about the safety of our skies?
I want to reiterate that safety is our top priority and that Canadian skies are safe. Aviation safety is at the very forefront of everything we promote and seek to protect. And although that term is used frequently, relating to safety being our top priority, it rings true today. And I am very committed as a minister to ensuring that throughout my department and indeed our government, that this notion that safety must always be our top priority is at the forefront of everything we do.
I do want to now turn, if you'll permit me, to another file that you're involved with, particularly in your capacity sitting on the Canada-U.S. Cabinet Committee that's dealing with the threat of these incoming tariffs. Yesterday, we heard from Donald Trump's incoming Commerce Secretary. He was in his confirmation hearing, actually, for the first time being pretty explicit that the tariffs he's threatening this weekend are very much tied to the border. They're not about the trade relationship. Those are safe for April. But he said, you know, that we've presented this border plan, and if we execute on it, the possibility exists that there won't be the tariffs imposed as of this weekend. What's the latest information you have on that? And do you believe we can escape the application of these tariffs?
Well, we are certainly working on numerous fronts to ensure that we are addressing the concerns that the United States has indicated it has. We've already put $1.3 billion into fortifying the border with new drones, with helicopters, and I know Minister McGuinty is in the United States now having the additional conversations relating to border security. On trade and tariffs, we are ready with counter tariffs. We will not escalate, but we will retaliate and push back very hard with various tranches of tariffs should the need arise when and if that occurs. And then thirdly, on defense spending, we are looking at ways to increase defense spending and accelerate the timeline to get to that 2% as has been requested. That is the full suite of prongs of activity that we're working on right now.
Do you have any timeline for the last one that you're mentioning? And I know, I mean, we did so many interviews over your time in defense on the subject. Like, you might not be directly involved, but obviously on the cabinet committee you are. Bill Blair, Minister Blair said the other day something like 2 years, then his office seemed to backtrack it. Like, is there a specific timeline you're working with on that?
I would say the name of the game there is acceleration, and how can we bring it forward from 2032? And that's going to depend on the fiscal frame and ensuring that we can meet our domestic obligations as well as increase the rapidity as we get to 2%.
I know you're also overseeing sort of a task force of sorts to lower internal trade barriers, and I have questions on that in a moment. Just one final question on the bigger response from the government should these tariffs be imposed. Sure. And that is the subject of a lot of political debate at the federal level, particularly today hearing from Jagmeet Singh, who says if in fact those tariffs come and your government needs to provide an aid package to workers who lose their job, then Parliament should come back early. Doesn't he have a point?
We are ready with aid and reinforcement for Canadian workers, and that will be the case regardless of whether Parliament is reconvened. We met as a cabinet committee this week, in fact, and those proposals and supports are ready to go. So I will just say that we are working now to ensure that we are ready, and we will be there for the Canadian population regardless of the scenario.
I do have to challenge you on that with great respect, Minister, though, because, you know, if I think back to COVID, there were things that you could do without the parliamentary process, certainly, around EI, for example, but there were other things like CERB and the business supports that put into place that did require legislation and making its way through Parliament. Is it not kind of selfish in the in the view of Canadians that your government is proroguing things to stave off an election when you could be sitting in there and passing legislation that ends up being very needed to help people who, millions of people who could lose their jobs?
I would characterize it as we need to be ready for any eventuality, and given that the House is set to come back at the end of March, should the need arise, we will be ready before then. And in fact, that's what responsible government is. And we will continue to execute on numerous fronts, including supports for Canadians as is necessary, given this very stressful time in our country.
I guess I would just point out that February 1st is this weekend, March 24th is, almost 2 months later. So I would imagine if there needs to be a response in between, I can understand why Canadians would hope that you would be willing to come back to Parliament earlier. I do want to ask you about internal trade, though, because you wrote an op-ed today and you lead that task force, as I mentioned. And certainly the blame does not fall solely at the feet of your government. I've covered many federal governments who have talked about reducing this, and provinces play a huge role as well. Why do you think that the barriers have not been reduced to a degree that would ultimately have put us in a different position against the backdrop or the threat of tariffs from Donald Trump? What do you think has impeded progress on this?
Each province and territory has the constitutional ability to ensure that it is doing what it can for its own domestic economy. And what that has meant is that jurisdictions have differing rules in place that negatively impact businesses, for example, that want to set up shop in differing jurisdictions, having to comply with different permitting requirements, or businesses that want to sell their goods across the country and have to comply with different requirements relating to container sizes, for example, or even in the transportation of those goods, where we see trucking requirements differ from province to province. What I'm proposing is collective action towards reducing and eliminating these barriers to trade. It should not be more expensive to sell alcohol in a neighboring jurisdiction than it is to transport it to France, which is the case for Annapolis Valley wine producers, for example.
Yeah, I feel like, to put a finer point on it, Canadians would find some of the data actually unbelievable. For example, a study from the IMF in 2019 found in many cases foreign countries are getting better access to Canada's market than Canadian companies themselves. And even when it comes to how much of a penalty almost that we pay, the IMF calculated, we're worried about 25% tariffs. They calculated that these barriers equate to a 21% tariff. You put in place, or your government, I should say, in 2017, a free trade agreement at Canada, sort of CFTA. Again, though, only 18 of 30 recommendations have actually been implemented. Why weren't you more worried about this since 2017? And ultimately, if you had been, would we be in a different position right now?
I actually have been worried about this for some time, and the momentum now is building towards ensuring that we can add up to $200 billion to the Canadian economy without going through Donald Trump. I've spoken with each province and territory in advance of tomorrow's meeting of the Committee on Internal Trade, and there is significant and palpable enthusiasm about moving forward. Every year we see about $530 billion of trading goods and services between the provinces and territories. We want to make sure that we are doing whatever it takes to make the Canadian economy more robust, increase productivity, and ensure that revenue accrues to Canadian businesses without even going through Donald Trump.
Should Canadians and Canadian businesses, though, have faith that that enthusiasm will actually translate into action and the reduction of those barriers? And what's your message to Canadians who are listening and maybe thinking, like, why does this always seem to take a crisis?
Well, Vassy, some progress has been made. In 2017, we did sign the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and we have seen provinces and territories at the table. The reality is that we need to keep working to reduce these internal barriers to trade, and that's going to take collective action in a complex federation with 13 subnational governments like Canada. And so the impetus has to be one of collective action, and I'm telling you, I am hearing that enthusiasm and that momentum building because we have a moment now to address these very complicated issues. So that'll be the work that we do tomorrow and in the weeks ahead, but it is an all-hands-on-deck moment to eliminate barriers to internal trade.
I will leave it on that note. Minister, I appreciate your time as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.